sua aceitação. Mas o samba brasileiro já nasce no coração, já nasce no coração. Tu que una vez me quisiste y a mí me dijiste te quiero a ti.
When we talked about Wittgenstein's sheer absence view of negative truths, let's say, the idea that you don't need truth makers or facts to make negative truths true, you just have the positive facts. And in passing, you made a connection between this on the ontological level and the distinction between untrue and not true. Is this correct in any sense? Is there an interesting parallel between the logical distinction between untruth and falsity on the one hand, and the absence view of negative truths on the one side, and the idea that there are negative facts?
Okay. So, look, there are a couple of principles here which are fundamental to the question you're asking. A logician would say, does truth commute with negation? Okay, so if it's true that not P, is it the same as it's not the case that P is true? So that principle has two halves. And the one is sometimes called exhaustion. If it's not the case that something is true, then its negation is true. So things must be either true or false. The converse of that is sometimes called exclusion. If something is not true, then it's not the case that it is true. Hang on, let me... okay, if not P is true, then it's not the case that P is true. Maybe if you put this online, you might want to put a little graphic in at this point. Okay, so exhaustion says that things have to be either true or false. Exhaustion says they have to be either true or false. Exclusion says they can't be both. Now, what to say about those principles? Well, if you believe in truth value gaps, but you believe everything's consistent, then you ain't going to subscribe to exhaustion. Because the fact that something is not true does not mean its negation is true, because something could be neither. Okay. So if you believe in truth value gaps, that's going to go out the window. And the most obvious dual of that is if you believe in gluts but not gaps, you're going to reject the converse principle. Namely, if the negation of something is true, then it's not true. And a dialethy is going to be a prima facie counterexample of that. All right. That's probably the most sensible way to go, to reject this principle of exclusivity. But it's not quite as simple as in the gap case, because in the glut case, you have the option of accepting the contradiction. So the gap theorist cannot accept exhaustion without committing themselves to a contradiction, because they're going to end up attributing the gappy thing an inconsistent status. But is it quite possible for a glut theorist actually to endorse exclusion? It just means that any contradiction of the form P and not P is going to turn into a contradiction of the form P is true, and it's not the case that P is true. So a contradiction about, I don't know, sets or motion or whatever is going to turn into a contradiction about truth. So suppose P, well then P is true. Okay, suppose not P, well then not P is true. And if you subscribe to exclusion, that means that P isn't true. So a contradiction to the form P and not P is going to turn into a contradiction to the form P is true and P isn't true. And okay, that's a contradiction. It's going to be another contradiction. You're going to be committed to more contradictions. Now, I don't think that's a terribly good thing to do, but some people do. And there are some dialethists who do think that truth simply commutes with negation. But often these people are deflationists, people like J.C. Beale. So they think that not P is true if and only if P is not true. So they've got exclusion and exhaustion both ways. So for them, any contradiction of any kind is going to turn into a contradiction about truth. Now, personally, I don't think that's the right way to go, but you can go that way. You just find more contradictions. This actually sort of takes us back to something we were discussing earlier about facts. Okay, because you can put the whole point in a factual register, because P is true if and only if there's a fact that P. Not P is true if and only if there's a fact that not P. And if you think that the fact that not P is the non-existence of a fact that P, then if P and not P is true, there's going to be then the fact that P is going to be existent and non-existent. Okay, so this contradiction about truth morphs into a contradiction about the existence of facts. But it's essentially the same move that's at issue here.
Okay, so in this case, you wouldn't be abandoning the general idea that Wittgenstein had about negative truth. You can still think that what makes a negative truth true is the sheer absence of a fact, and you load all the weight of the dialethia on a single entity, a fact, which both exists and doesn't exist.
You can do that. Okay. It's a move in the game. What's really at issue here is the semantics of negation, or if you want to put it in slightly sort of more technical terms, the truth conditions of negation. So, in classical logic, the truth conditions of negation are not P is true, if and only if it's not the case that P is true. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not the way it normally works in the semantics of paraconsistent logics, because truth and falsity, that is, the truth of P and the truth of not P, fall apart, and you have to treat them equally handily. So your semantics is consistent, as it were, because it's not forcing on you an inconsistent semantics. However, if you're a dialethist, you do have this option of retaining the classical truth conditions, namely that not P is true if P isn't true. And then you're going to have to, if you're a dialethist, you're going to have to say that P both is and isn't true. So you're going to have an inconsistent semantics. But, the semantics of negation are contentious. In the last 2,500 years of logic, there have been God knows how many theories of negation. Mm-hmm. Boolean negation is at least the entrenchment of the theory of negation is a relatively modern phenomenon. I don't think you find it in Aristotle. You might find it in some of the medievals. But, logicians have argued about how negation works for 2,500 years. So these disputes about negation are not going to be resolved lightly. Yeah,
now that you mention that, an early objection to dialetheism has been precisely this, something along the lines of, if you think that something could be the case and not be the case, you're simply not using negation for what it is, or you're changing the meaning of negation in such a way that what you would have there would not be really a contradiction, but something else.
Sure. This is quite change the.
It does. I know it does change a bit the subject, but perhaps before we get to that objection, we might close our discussion of existential dialetheas by discussing which kinds of existential dialetheas are possible. So we said it is way possible if we refer to an object by a description, and if this description turns out to be contradictory, this is enough to create an existential dialethia. So, for example, in the case of
if the thing describes something, it exists.
Yeah, clearly. So for example, in the case of motion, if we accept the idea that motion entails dialetheas, and I describe a train by its location, so the train that is now here, and the train happens to be both here and not here, well, then this seems to create a descriptive existential dialethia. But I was wondering if you think that it is also possible to have existential dialetheas in cases where you have direct reference to the entity in question. And so you're not describing it, but you say pointing at something and saying, well, this exists and it does not exist, where the anaphorical pronoun is parasitic semantically on the first name or pointing gesture. Do you think that that's possible?
Sure. Come back to Jesus. Suppose our pod Jesus dies a lingering death of coronavirus, which takes him, he's going for 5 minutes, let's say. Then in that transition area, assuming that you buy some kind of dialectic account of Socrates, Jesus is dead and Jesus exists and Jesus doesn't exist. So the word Jesus is a direct reference for our poor, hypothetical, unfortunate Jesus.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Pleasure, as ever.
And see you next week.
Ciao, Emiliano.
Ciao.
Oh.